Hey, something that's really surprised me over the last 20 years that I've been testifying as an expert witness in DNA profiling cases, literally around the world in over 100 criminal trials, is how much more scientific DNA profiling could and should be. All right, now let me tell you what I mean by that, but to do that, I'm going to need to get you all to be DNA profiling experts with me. All right, now trust me, it's going to be a lot easier than you think. Okay, so let's get right to work and start talking about what DNA profiles look like. The slide behind me shows you what DNA profiles look like these days. They essentially are a set of graphs. We have a fancy term for them as DNA profiling experts. We want to call them electropherograms. But on the graphs, you see some peaks. The peaks correspond to fragments of DNA that you find associated with an evidence sample. And we call those peaks alleles. The alleles have names. They're given to them by some computer software that puts some numbers under them. The numbers are their names. And we'll get this information across an individual's chromosomes from a number of different locations. Those are called loci. All right? And when all is said and done, a DNA profile distills down to a table of alleles like the one that you see here on the screen. It's just a list of the locations where we looked for information and the information that we found, those tables of alleles. Now, there's very little that we can tell about a person from their DNA profile, and this information is really only useful to us to the extent to which we can distinguish between one person's DNA profile and another's. All right? Now, whether you believe it or not, you guys are fast on the way to being DNA profiling experts. And I want to build your confidence right now by letting you take a test. All right? So here is a DNA profile from an evidence sample. It comes from a real court case that I've been involved with, and it might look familiar to you. It's the same one that we'd been talking about before, right? So nothing too shocking there, but it really does come from a court case. And in a minute, I'm going to have you guys take a test. I'm going to ask you all to raise your right hand, and then I'm going to show you the DNA profile of a suspect that's part of the investigation for which this crime scene sample was tested. And when you've decided if the suspect could be the source or could not be the source of this DNA profile, I just want you to lower your hands. All right, so that's the nature of the test. Let's have you do that. Raise your right hand. Audience participation, right? And here's the suspect's DNA profile. When you figured it out, when you think you know if he's the source or not, lower your hand. Now take a look around, because it took about, 5 seconds for almost everybody in this room to lower their hand. That's all that it took. This is pretty easy, isn't it? And I'll put words in your mouth, because what you've all done is you found that pretty much wherever you started to do the comparison between the suspect and the evidence sample is that there was a difference, right? And in a word, here's part of the important vocabulary of DNA profiling. Suspect number 1 is excluded as a possible contributor. They just can't be the source of the DNA that was found in that evidence sample. So check it out. You guys have passed your first important test as budding DNA profiling experts. I think you're ready to take it up a notch and take a second test. Let's get rid of suspect number 1. And I'm going to ask you to raise your hands once again. And I'm going to show you suspect number 2. When you figure it out for suspect 2, lower your hand. Here he is, suspect number 2. What do you think? Now, suspect 2 is a little harder, isn't he? It's taken a little longer, but people are putting their hands down left and right. And what you're finding is wherever you do a comparison now, suspect 2 looks like he may have some explaining to do, doesn't it? Right? I mean, his alleles are matching those that you see in the evidence sample at every turn. Now, the heights of the peaks are a little bit different, but that just tells us that there was less DNA or more DNA in one sample relative to another. The important thing is the alleles are all matching up. And so at the end, no matter how hard we try, we fail to exclude suspect 2 as a possible contributor. And again, I've already given you the bottom line. He's going to have some explaining to do, how it is his DNA came to be associated with this crime scene sample. All right, well, one last thing I need to impart to you to get you all to be certified DNA profiling experts is this. The evidence sample that we've been looking at so far here this afternoon is not a particularly typical evidence sample. This is one that's really easy to interpret, right? There's no trouble distinguishing between what's signal and what's noise, where there are peaks and where there aren't peaks. This is what an evidence sample much more often looks like. You have to bear in mind that samples that are collected for evidence are often out in the wind and the rain for days before they make it into a lab. People step on them, they spit on them, they're messy, right? And you can see indications of that on this new set of electropherograms. The heights of the peaks are smaller, it's harder to sometimes distinguish between signal and noise, and there are spots where we may not even be getting complete information. All right? There are issues with all three of the graphs for this evidence sample, but to save time and to help us focus our attention, let's just zoom in on the one on the upper right, the blue electropherogram. All right? And let's just ask some critical questions about the blue electropherogram. We've got a suspect, let's call her Bonnie, right, for whom we know a DNA profile. We know it from her, there's never any question as to what the suspect's profile is. If there is, you just go back and get more of their DNA and test it again. But we know that Bonnie, at the first locus on the upper left, the D3 locus, her DNA profile is 1717. And what that means in practical terms is that she got a 17 from her mother, a 17 from her father, and that's all that she has that she can add to an evidence sample if she were to leave something behind. And sure enough, when you look up at the evidence sample, you'll see that the software has labeled a peak a 17. The red box beneath it is just the height of the peak. The green box is telling you the name of the peak. She's got a 17. Sure enough, in the evidence sample, there's a 17. Now, I'm sure you've also noticed that to the left of the 17 is another peak that's labeled 12. Now, Bonnie does not have a 12 that she can contribute. If that 12 is real, then Bonnie can't be the source of the DNA. We have to exclude her, right? Well, let me pause here and tell you this is not the first time I've shown people this particular graph. In the past, I've shown it to people where the crowd has been nothing but prosecutors and crime lab employees. And when I start to suggest that Bonnie should be excluded as a possible contributor because of that 12, they get fidgety. Right? And I stop and I say, well, have I said something wrong? And they'll give me feedback like, well, wait, that 12 isn't really signal. That's noise. It's too short compared to the 17. It's misshapen. It's kind of bumpy, right? That's not signal. That's noise. The only thing that's signal there is the 17. So you can't exclude Bonnie because of that 12. That's not really signal. All right, let's move along. I'm sure you've jumped ahead of me and you figured out that Bonnie has some issues at VWA. She's a 15-17, and that's what we see in the electropherogram. And at the FGA locus, the one furthest to the right, she's a 25-25, and sure enough, I think that's got to be the prettiest peak that you see in this graph. There's a 25 at the FGA locus in the evidence sample. And I know what you're thinking. There's this big thing to the left of the 25 as well. There's one last thing I need to tell you as DNA profiling experts. There's some vocabulary. That is something you'll see a lot of in your career as a DNA profiling expert. About every third DNA profile you'll look at will have something that looks like that. It comes up frequently enough that analysts have a name for it. It's a technical artifact, and the name is, get ready, blob. All right? You can impress your friends with your DNA profiling vocabulary later today. Just keep talking about blobs and you'll have it covered. So that's an artifact. It's not reproducible. Nobody knows what causes them. It could be a bit of dust in the machine that's generating the graph. It's not important. It's just even the software is not sure what to do with it, right? It can't put a number on it. It calls it an OL allele. That's short for off-ladder allele, meaning that it's sort of like where a 20 might be or a 21. The software doesn't even know what to do with it. You can't draw any conclusions from it. Again, it's an artifact. And so when all is said and done, what do we say in answer to the question on the screen here? Can we exclude Bonnie or not? The answer apparently is no, because all the stuff that doesn't correspond to Bonnie is apparently some artifact or noise, and the stuff that does correspond to Bonnie, we can talk about being, yes, that's legitimate signal. Okay, now I've already told you I've used this graph before. There have been times that I've used this graph, though, where I have not told the prosecutors or the crime lab employees anything about Bonnie. Instead, I just start talking with them about her friend. Can you guess? Clyde, right? So you guys are good, right? You are really ready to go out there as DNA profiling experts. So do what you can now to forget what you know about Bonnie, and let's talk about Clyde. Right? Clyde at the D3 locus is a 1217. And sure enough, in the electropherogram on that graph, we see at the D3 locus, there's a 12 and a 17 that's labeled, right? Now I worry about that 12 though, right? It's too short, it's kind of bumpy, it's asymmetrical. That doesn't look like a peak, it looks like it could be noise. And the prosecutors and the crime lab employees get fidgety. And I ask, whoa, have I said something wrong? And they'll tell me, you apparently are neglecting the fact that this is a trace evidence sample. There was very little DNA to work with. Look how small the peaks are. When you're dealing with small amounts of DNA, the peak heights are small. Sometimes they're misshapen. That's not noise, that's signal. That 12 is real. Oh, good to know. You know, VWA, yeah, sure, he's a 1517. That's just what we see in the evidence sample. At FGA, he's a 2025. I accept the 25 is there, but that's not a 20, is it? That's a blob. We all know that, right? So that's a blob. That's not a 20. And the analysts will tell me, no, but you don't understand, apparently, that's a dead spot. We don't know what's behind that 20, that blob. There may well be a 20 there. So when all is said and done, what do we conclude about Clyde? Well, apparently, he can't be excluded as a possible contributor either. Now, you guys see the whole context. There's a problem here, isn't it? Isn't there? We have two different people with different DNA profiles, neither of whom can be excluded as possible contributors to this critical evidence sample, right? And that's just not the way things are supposed to be. I'll tell you the nature of the problem. The nature of the problem here is that we have been letting ourselves be guided by the subject of the investigation when we're interpreting the object, the evidence sample. You know, I can put this in simpler English. We're being subjective as opposed to objective. And to the extent to which any sort of technique is subjective, it's not scientific. All right? Now, psychologists have explored this phenomenon for many years, not just in the context of DNA profiling. They say that what we've been wrestling with here is a phenomenon that essentially is known as examiner bias. And examiner bias is a problem particularly when you're dealing with ambiguous results and there's one particular outcome that the analyst is expecting is going to be the right answer. I got good news for us all. There is a simple cure for the affliction of examiner bias. You know what that cure is? Very simply, it's blind testing. Why don't we have analysts interpret the evidence samples, let the evidence samples speak for themselves without any knowledge of the suspect's DNA profile? Why don't we do that? Well, I'll tell you, this isn't a fresh idea. This is about a 5 or 6 year old idea, and it's been surprisingly controversial. Crime lab employees and prosecutors don't like the idea of blind testing. The types of arguments that I hear from them are along these lines. They'll say that the work that they're doing is critically important. There literally are instances where people's lives will be on the line on the basis of the decisions they're making. And it's really important that they get the right answer. Right? And that means they need to take advantage of all the information that's available to them, including the suspect's DNA profile. And I'll tell you, I'm not persuaded. by that particular argument or that line of reasoning, because it seems to me it's very similar to a student telling a teacher, I really want to do well on the test you're about to give me, and I'm confident that I'll do much better if you give me the answer key before you hand me the test, right? It's literally laughable, right? You're laughing at the prospect of that because it defeats the purpose of the test in the first place. So, why don't we just pursue this idea a little bit further? Why don't we ask that crime lab employees and prosecutors have blind testing done? I think what's going to happen is if labs start to adopt this procedure, that test results are going to be interpreted much more conservatively. For evidence samples that look like this one, I think a lab would be much more likely to simply say that no conclusions can be drawn, rather than simply reporting that Bonnie or Clyde might be the source. And at the end of the day, you know what that's going to do? That's going to make DNA testing more objective, more scientific, and it seems to me that that's just a very good idea all around. Thank you very much.